So this is my Arcum Dagsson Commander deck, and Arcum is a popular general amongst competitive players for a number of reasons. First of all, he's going to give us access to blue, which is probably the best color in the format. But mostly Arcum is a tutoring general, and in a format where you've only got access to one copy of each card in your deck, a general who has tutoring capabilities is going to offer you a lot of consistency and a lot of fun usually. So Arcum obviously forces you to build around an artifact theme, but there are a number of ways you can abuse this. I've seen players just build a straight toolbox theme. I've seen players build sort of an artifact aggro theme. Most of the time though, people play Arcum to build a combo control type of deck. It's really easy to assemble a 2-card combo with artifacts. There's a lot of overpowered artifacts, and you can usually back those up with counterspells pretty easily. So yeah, that's what this deck is. It's a straightforward combo deck. It's going to try and get out an artifact creature as soon as possible, use Arcum's ability to cheat out some of the nastiest artifacts in the format, and lock your opponents out of the game as quickly as possible. I guess a bit of a disclaimer here. Some people tend to think that Arcum is kind of one of those douchebag generals, but there's a reason we build decks like this. There's a lot of players around here who build Captain Sisay or Zur the Enchanter, and it's fun every now and then to sort of bust out these overpowered generals and see what they can do to each other. I think it's really important to have decks of varying strength so that you can always sort of play to whatever strength deck your opponent is playing, and sort of have a competitive game no matter what. That said, this is probably one of our least played decks just because it tends to get hated off the table a lot. I can't imagine why. But yeah, so the deck list might not be so up to date, it might not be kept up to par as much as it should be, but yeah, just a warning. So the first thing we're going to look at is Arcum himself. He's a mono blue general, which means we're not going to have access to some of the best cards in the format. For instance, the best tutors and the best spot removal do not exist in blue. However, we're not too worried about tutors because we have a general with that capability. And spot removal and stuff like that, not such a big deal because we're probably just going to try and combo off before anything they play actually matters. So we're not too worried about that. Plus we have access to counterspells, which in theory can deal with anything the opponents do. Arcum himself has a relatively easy casting cost, which is pretty significant I think, because it means you can rely on colorless artifact acceleration more than you would in other decks. It's nice that he doesn't have a heavy blue requirement. His ability is going to encourage us to run a lot of artifact creatures as well as a lot of non-creature artifacts, and you need to sort of strike a balance there where you're always going to have access to something that you can sacrifice and have enough bombs to choose from in your deck. Arcum is actually a very frail general, and the reason I say that is that he has a tap ability in his activation here. And that means he needs to stay on the board for an entire turn before you can even do anything with him. And odds are you're going to have 3 players who are going to do their best to try and kill him in that one turn. So it's sort of a challenge to try and protect him for a full turn. There's a few ways you can do that. You can just give him haste right off the bat so he can use his ability right away. Or you can hold back some mana for a counter spell. Or you can just power him out as quickly as possible and start activating him before your opponents even have a chance to tutor up their spot removal or get the mana they need to cast a Wrath of God or something. So the main challenges with this deck are going to try and deal with the fact that Arcum is a very fragile general and that everyone at the table is going to try and kill him. So first we're going to take a look at some of the artifact creatures in this deck. And like I said before, one of the ways we can sort of combat Arcum's frailty is by getting him out as quickly as possible and getting an activation out of him right away. So the best way to do that is to run small artifact creatures who also have mana tapping abilities. So they're going to accelerate Arcum out and they're going to provide a body for him to sacrifice right away. So these two here, Manakin and Millikin, basically do the same thing. They come out for 2 mana and tap for colorless. Silver Myr will give us blue. Plague Myr is going to give us colorless and he's got infect, whoop-de-doo. And Etherium Sculptor here, he's actually not going to accelerate into Arcum because Arcum is not an artifact spell, but he is going to accelerate almost every other card in the deck, and he's going to give us a body to sacrifice, so he works really well. So there are a lot of ways to recur artifacts from your graveyard to play or to your hand, and that's really good because a lot of people are going to be gunning for your combo pieces once they see them come down, so you want to be able to protect those if you can. So here are some creatures who have those abilities. Myr Retriever, 1/1 for 2, and when it dies you can return artifact from your graveyard to your hand. And Arcbound Reclaimer, which is going to let you do that twice. These two are really useful if you're going to lock someone down with a Mindslaver or do some Sundering Titan shenanigans. So those can sort of end the game by themselves. And then we have Scarecrone, who's only going to be able to target artifact creatures. But again, I've got some pretty nasty artifact creatures in this deck, like the aforementioned Sundering Titan and some other nasty tricks that you're going to see later. Some more artifact creatures with utility here. Solemn Simulacrum, always a solid choice in a deck like this because it's got a come into play and a leaves play ability, and this deck is really good at sort of abusing artifacts with come into play and sacrifice abilities. So this guy works well with the general. He's going to give us another island when he comes out, so he's a good choice for this deck. Phyrexian Metamorph, one of those fairly recent cards. For only 3 mana, he's a clone as well as a sculpting steel, and that just works pretty perfectly for this deck. He's good at killing generals, he's good at copying soul rings, and in a deck like this he can do so many other crazy things. I don't know, copying a Duplicant, copying a Mindslaver, or whatever. He's just really versatile, and he's going to work with Arcum Dagsson because he's an artifact creature. Duplicant pretty much works in any deck, especially good in this deck, which can potentially recur it, and which can use the finished Duplicant to tutor up some Darksteel Forge or something. And then Master Transmuter. This is an interesting card for this deck because it sort of serves a couple purposes. Its ability here is going to let us protect some of our artifacts that are on the battlefield. So if somebody actually draws a Return to Dust or whatever for our Darksteel Forge, this is one way that we can protect it by returning it to our hand. Also, of course, you can use this thing to sneak out some artifacts which ended up in your hand. Like if you want to get your Darksteel Forge out, and you can't do it with Arcum because it's stuck in your hand, the Master Transmuter is one way that you can sneak that out at instant speed, uncounterable, on the cheap. So this is a really good choice for this deck. And moving into some of the nastier artifact creatures, here we have Karn Silver Golem. He's a good choice for the deck, mostly because of his interaction with Mycosynth Lattice, which is a card we'll get to later. He's going to combo well with that. Plus, he's just a great defensive card for this deck. If you're playing Arcum at a multiplayer table and all of your opponents know what he's capable of, you're probably going to get attacked a lot, so it's nice to have this guy out as a blocker. He can also turn your board of sort of mana rocks and utility artifacts into a pretty threatening, aggressive position. So you can actually use him as a win condition. You know, make your Mycosynth Lattice 6/6 or make your Darksteel Forge a 9/9. Word to the wise though, don't actually animate your Darksteel Forge because somebody will path it. Memnarch is a really good choice for this deck. This deck loves to interact with artifacts, so his first ability there is pretty useful all on its own. It's pretty cool if you can make your Trinket Mage an artifact creature and then sacrifice it to Arcum. Mostly he's in here because he's a great infinite mana dump. If your deck can somehow make infinite mana, you really want a way to win with that as soon as possible. So he's going to gain control of all the permanents on the board, and he's just great utility all on his own. And then Sundering Titan, really easy to abuse in a deck like this, and once you've abused him once or twice, you're probably well on your way to winning. One of those cards that isn't going to make you many friends, but really the time for that is come and gone if you're playing Arcum. And then the only two non-artifact creatures in the deck, these two are both pretty obvious choices. Trinket Mage has the two usual targets in Sol Ring and Sensei's Divining Top. It's also got a couple really good targets in Voltaic Key and Brittle Effigy, so he's really solid in this deck. Great if you can recur him, because he's going to pull out some real gems from your deck. And Palinchron, this deck is running lots of mana doublers, so he is an easy way to make infinite mana and combo off. So moving into my non-creature artifacts, we really need to protect Arcum, and we really want him to use his ability as quickly as possible. So effects that give him haste are very useful. And Lightning Greaves here is pretty perfect because it's going to give him haste and it's going to protect him from spot removal. And it has a 0 equip, so pretty perfect for an Arcum deck. 1000-Year Elixir, maybe not as great. It's going to let me use his tap ability the turn he comes out, so it sort of gets the job done. Being able to untap him and use his ability twice in one turn, probably overkill. At that point you're probably comboing off right away, but if you can do it, then that's great. These are two of the best targets you can have once you're tutoring with Arcum. Some of the best ways you can win is just by locking your opponents out of the game. Mindslaver is always a classic for that because you get to control someone's turn, and it's not that difficult to recur in this deck. We do have lots of ways to bring back artifacts like Academy Ruins and Myr Retriever, and we can easily pull this off indefinitely. So that's a pretty great way to end the game, I think. Winter Orb is sort of a classic in the Arcum decks because you can spring this on someone when they least suspect it, sort of tutor this up and bring it out at the end of turn. It's a great way for killing someone who just cast a Pact of Negation or something. It's especially good in this deck because we're running a lot of mana rocks, and those are greatly beneficial with Winter Orb because you're not suffering so much from having your lands not on tap. Yeah, Winter Orb, usually a better choice than people think because you're probably going to have the advantage once you start tutoring with Arcum every turn. This is basically another way to protect Arcum because people are not going to expect that they don't have access to the mana next turn. So the spot removal they have in their hand, they're not going to be able to cast it. Moving on to the big artifacts, these are sort of the iconic cards that people think of when they're building an Arcum deck. Mycosynth Lattice, all permanents are artifacts in addition to their other types. Honestly, I can't list off all the ways you can abuse this. The possibilities are limitless. There are all sorts of weird interactions you can get into once this card is in play. There's a ton of ways you can combo with this, sort of figure them out as you go. The best one is Karn, because you can activate his ability to turn their lands into 0/0 creatures. Nevinyrral's Disc will blow up every permanent on the board. You can start sacrificing your Trinket Mage to Arcum. You can do all sorts of junk with this card. So it's really a good idea to get this in play. You can figure out what sort of combos you can generate with this once it's out. And Darksteel Forge for 9 mana, it's definitely a bargain if you can sneak this in with Arcum Dagsson or Master Transmuter. If you don't know what else to tutor for when you're searching with Arcum, this is always a good choice because Darksteel Forge is really, really hard to get rid of. It's not like a creature which can be removed with Path to Exile. An indestructible artifact will probably be out for the rest of the game unless they have, Return to Dust or Chaos Warp, one of those few cards that can actually deal with it. So again, this is mostly a utility card, but also it has a lot of combo implications, especially with Mycosynth Lattice here, because it basically means all of your permanents are indestructible, and once you've got that, there are a number of ways you can pull off the win, like Nevinyrral's Disc, for example. So speaking of Nevinyrral's Disc, here it is. The important thing to note about this card is that it doesn't actually say sacrifice Nevinyrral's Disc. Its ability actually destroys itself. So if you've got an indestructible Nevinyrral's Disc thanks to Darksteel Forge, then you can blow up this card every single turn, destroy the opponent's creatures, enchantments, and artifacts every single turn. Now if you can add Mycosynth Lattice into the mix, then you're destroying their lands as well because those are also artifacts. If you can get all three out, then yeah, you've pretty much won the game. Of course, Disc is just useful all on its own because blue doesn't have access to a lot of board resets, and this one is a board reset that is tutorable by Arcum, so it's very good in this deck. Oblivion Stone, obviously a very solid choice as well because it doesn't come into play tapped, so you can use it the turn it comes out. All is Dust, not actually an artifact, but very good in a mono blue deck, especially one with such a high density of artifacts like this one, so a pretty obvious choice for this deck for sure. And the rest of these artifacts are just utility ones. Sensei's Divining Top is always good enough to get into any deck. Having access to the top 3 cards of your library means you have a lot more choices. It's pretty much indestructible because you can always respond to removal by sticking it on the top of your deck. And it's always useful to have access to the top card of your deck, especially when you're running, Academy Ruins, Arcbound Reclaimer, Mystical Tutor, Future Sight, which you can combo with. So yeah, Sensei's Dividing Top, always good in any deck. Crystal Shard, pretty solid utility in any blue deck. I'm not really seeking to abuse this like a lot of decks do with come to play abilities. I do have Trinket Mage, but mostly this is just going to protect my creatures and hopefully cause an annoyance to my opponents who will not be able to tap out if I have this out. Spine of Ish Saw. 7 mana is a lot for Vindicate, but this deck can cheat it into play. So it's useful that Arcum can tutor up a Vindicate whenever I need it. Obviously I have a lot of ways to abuse this by destroying it and bringing it back. Something like Master Transmuter, for example. I can return this to my hand and put it back out again to keep abusing it. Yeah, Brittle Effigy, Trinket Mageable because it only costs 1. And blue doesn't have a lot of spot removal, so this is one way I can exile creatures permanently. Pretty solid, and I have ways to recur it. And Vedalken Shackles, solid choice in any blue deck, which runs a lot of islands, as this deck does. This deck loves artifact mana because it wants to accelerate into Arcum as quickly as possible. Also, it needs extra mana to protect Arcum with counterspells usually, so it's not always good enough just to get to 4 mana as quickly as possible and power him out if you suspect your opponent is holding on to, a Hinder or a Path to Exile or something. You might want to wait. So it's great to get ahead of your opponents in mana. Sol Ring, usually an obvious choice in any deck. Voltaic Key, not actually artifact mana, but in this deck that's what it's going to serve as because so many mana rocks, I'm untapping my mana rocks usually. I've got a few other ways I can abuse this card, obviously, especially if I have Mycosynth out, because then it can untap any permanent. Thran Dynamo, a really good choice in any deck. 3 colorless mana. Not always sustainable in some decks with the generals having high color demands in the casting cost, but Arcum does have 3 colorless mana as casting cost. Gilded Lotus, kind of a lot of mana to spend for a mana rock, but Arcum does let us put cards like this into play for free, so that works really well. Basalt Monolith, not as great as Grim Monolith, obviously, but it does give us access to 3 colorless mana on a 3 casting cost mana rock, so that's pretty solid. And this card actually combos with another card in this deck, which I'll get to later. And then Guardian Idol, obviously only taps for 1, so not that great. But this falls under the category of artifact creatures which accelerate into Arcum. So he's kind of like the Manakin, Millikin, Silvermere that I showed you earlier, except he's less susceptible to spot removal since he is an artifact on your opponent's turns. So that makes this a very solid card for this deck. Rounding out the artifact mana, we have the 3 artifact mana doublers, Extraplanar Lens, Gauntlet of Power, and Caged Sun. Extraplanar Lens is obviously the weakest because it forces you to imprint a land, which means you're sort of running the risk of getting this card blown up and then you're behind by 1 island. But it does come out on turn 3 or sooner, so it's pretty cheap. Gauntlet of Power for 5 mana potentially benefits your opponents. And Caged Sun, sort of the same thing, except it only benefits you. So for 1 extra mana, you sort of reduce the risk of putting your opponent too far ahead. So moving into the support cards, this is a blue deck, so it does rely heavily on counter spells to protect the general and to keep the combos alive. We're running an even dozen counter spells, and we're mostly focusing on the best ones. Counter spells which cost 2 mana are always solid, so the classic counter spell is always a good choice. Arcane Denial, only 2 mana as well. Dissipate, 3 mana, but this one gives us access to a little bit of graveyard hate. So if someone is recurring something, this is one way you can get rid of it for good. And then Mana Drain is just super broken, especially in a deck which can take advantage of mass amounts of colorless mana. Next we have Hinder and the brand new Spell Crumple. These cards are very similar. Both very useful for getting rid of opponents' generals permanently. This is the kind of card which can single-handedly win a Zur or Captain Sisse matchup, because those matchups are all about dealing with the general as quickly as possible. And something like this can just end those games right away. They're also both pretty solid, like Dissipate, because they help get rid of pesky spells which your opponents keep recurring. A lot of the time we're bringing out Arcum on turn 3 or 4, and we're not leaving open mana to protect him with counter magic, so free counter spells are very, very important. Foil, a bit of card disadvantage there, but it's usually worth it. Pact of Negation and Force of Will. These are all going to help us protect Arcum without having to leave any islands open. And rounding out the rest of our counter spells, we have Forbid. Buyback is always really solid because sometimes you want to keep your Forbid in your hand. Cryptic Command. 4 mana is a lot to pay for a counter spell, but you can't say no to this versatility, especially being able to return a permanent to its owner's hand. You don't usually want to waste a spot in your deck on Boomerang, but a lot of the time you find that you need to get rid of something on the board, and this is one way that blue can do that. And then randomly Desertion makes the cut. It's cool if you can steal an artifact because this deck is good at interacting with those. Blue does have access to some tutors, and fortunately they're usually based around artifacts. So we have Fabricate here, search a library for any artifact for just 3 mana, pretty solid. Transmute Artifact, this is definitely a gem from one of the older sets, Antiquities. So yeah, you're sacrificing an artifact, paying the difference, and finding any artifact and putting it directly into play. So definitely a solid card. You might need some extra mana open if you're going for your Darksteel Forge or something, but it's great to have a tutor like this, especially if you need to get up a artifact creature, and Arcum cannot target those. Tezzeret the Seeker. Obviously the first 2 abilities are the most important ones. The first one is potentially giving you a ton of mana, and the second one is going to hopefully tutor up your combo pieces. I can't imagine actually using that third ability there, but you know, you never know if you need to smack someone with a few soul rings or whatever. Mystical Tutor, always a solid choice in any blue deck. Usually you're going to grab Force of Will with this, or Time Stretch or something. All as Dust as well is a pretty common choice. And then rounding out the support cards, we have some of the best utility in blue. Capsize. I said before, you usually don't want to waste any spots on boomerang type effects, but you can usually make an exception for Capsize. The speed of the games in EDH means you can usually afford to get to 6 mana and start abusing the buyback. Also, this deck has a few ways to generate infinite mana, and so it's very important to have ways to win with that. So Capsize will win with infinite mana by returning all of your opponent's permanents. Future Sight, just amazing card advantage in blue. This will also combo with Sensei's Divining Top, of course, to let you draw cards for just 1 mana. Jace the Mind Sculptor, just really good utility. If you ever end up in a single player game, this is the kind of card that can just act as an alternate win condition, because you can build towards the ultimate and protect him with counter spells pretty easily. Time Stretch, just another great blue card. This deck is really good at accelerating towards this and getting it out as quickly as possible. Sometimes the only thing you need to do to win is just take a few turns in a row to set up Arcum, protect him, and get your combo together. And then Power Artifacts. Yeah, this is kind of embarrassing because this is actually in here as a combo piece with Basalt Monolith. If you enchant Basalt Monolith with this, that's infinite colorless mana. However, for some reason this deck doesn't actually have a way to win with infinite colorless mana. Capsize and Memnarch both require blue mana. I think there used to be a blue Sun Zenith in here, but it got taken out or something. So like right now this is a completely dead card, so that shows you how much time we put into updating this deck list here. So moving on to the mana base, because we're trying to abuse Extraplanar Lens and Cage Sun and stuff, we're going to try and run as many islands as possible, but there are a few non-basic lands that we definitely need to run. These 3 are the most important by far because they are lands which can turn into artifact creatures, which means I can sacrifice them to Arcum. We have Mishra's Factory, Blinkmoth Nexus, and Inkmoth Nexus. And yeah, in fact, we've got a Plague Mirror in here, so that's like alternate win condition. But seriously, yeah. Some more important non-basics in this deck. Hall of the Bandit Lord, definitely a perfect choice for any deck that has a tapping general. This is another way to give Arcum haste. Academy Ruins, obviously amazing in this deck. This can, combo off with Mind Slaver to take someone out of the game really quickly. It's also just going to help us protect our combo pieces and stop us from milling ourselves out. And yeah, just really good on the land. Manamo, School at Water's Edge. This can untap Arcum. Yeah, so we can use them twice. And rounding out the non-basic lands, we have Teleria West. Pretty good in this deck because it can get a Pact of Negation. Can also grab the Academy Ruins or the Hall of the Bandit Lord or one of those artifact creature lands, so that's really good. Vesuva, pretty solid in any deck. Can destroy enemy legendary lands. Can also copy the Ancient Tomb or the Inkmoth Nexus or something, because we really want to go for that Infect win. Ancient Tomb, usually good in aggressive decks, but it's also good in this deck because we're trying to get Arcum out as quickly as possible. So this is another way we can get him out on turn 3. And Strip Mine, just a really solid choice for any deck, because you often need to destroy lands. Islands, lots of them. Yeah, I can't afford snow cupboards. So that's the deck. I don't want to oversimplify what this stack of combos plus counter spells plays like. I mean, if you're playing against a table full of players who want to kill you first, then there's definitely a challenging element to playing an Arcum deck. You gotta figure out what's worth countering, when a good time to force your combo through is, and how to balance your threat management. So this is how the deck is going to play out. Your first couple turns, you're definitely going to want to get one of these artifact creatures on the table. Something like Millikin or Silvermere. These are always great because they're going to accelerate into Arcum, as well as give you that body that you need to sacrifice to him and get the Tinker. Artifacts which turn into creatures, or lands which turn into artifact creatures, these are great because they are not creatures on your opponent's turn, so they are harder to remove. Like your Manakin or your Silvermere, these will often get killed right away because people know that you need them for Arcum. If you can, set yourself up with some artifact mana. If you can't get Arcum online on turn 3, then it's always a good idea to generate a bunch of mana so you can back them up with counter spells. But yeah, eventually you're going to want to bring Arcum out, and probably don't even bother doing it unless you actually have an artifact creature out, or else some way to protect him. Otherwise he's just going to get nuked for no reason. So you're going to protect him with Lightning Greaves, give him haste with Hall of the Bandit Lord. These are really good choices. So once you've got him out, there's a ton of different combos you can set up. I'm probably missing some. There's so many ways you can combo with this deck. Most of them are built around Darksteel Forge and Mycosynth Lattice. These are always good choices when you're tutoring. Mycosynth Lattice plus Nevinyrral's Disc plus Darksteel Forge. That's one of the most common ways to combo out. Karn cannot be tutored with Arcum, but he plus Mycosynth Lattice is a really good combo. Destroy everyone's lands. You can just generate infinite mana with Palinchron plus a mana doubler like Gauntlet of Power, and then you just need a Capsize or a Memnarch to abuse that infinite mana. You can draw out your deck with Sensei's Divining Top plus Future Sight, and if you've got Etherium Sculptor out, then it's not going to cost you 1 mana, so that's infinite. Spine of Ishsaw, Master Transmuter, not an infinite combo, just a really neat synergy. And of course we've got this Red Herring combo, which doesn't do anything because we forgot to put a Stroke of Genius in this deck. But seriously, it's a pretty good combo. I mean, none of these other combos actually kill players, they just sort of destroy the board, and you're sort of hoping they're going to scoop. But if you've got an infinite mana Stroke of Genius combo, then that will actually kill somebody. You don't have to combo it to win. In fact, a lot of Arcum decks are sort of built around just locking players out of the game. So recurring on Mindslaver is a really good way to take one player out of the game, and it's really easy for this deck to abuse that. Mindslaver is another great Arcum target. It's great in one-on-one games, maybe not so much in multiplayer, but if you do need to lock 3 players out at once, recurring Sundering Titan is really easy, and Winter Orb is always a good choice as well. Winter Orb is another way you can protect Arcum, because players need mana to kill him, and you can also sort of combo this with your artifact mana to make sure you're the only one who actually has access to mana. Make sure you're running lots of ways to protect your combo pieces. stuff like Mycosynth Lattice and Gauntlet of Power. These are the kind of cards which get blown off the table really quickly. Fortunately, you have artifact creatures like Myr Retriever or Junk Diver, which unfortunately we don't have one of yet. These are cards which can act as an Arcum fodder, as well as protect the cards in your graveyard. Academy Ruins, obviously a really good choice. Make sure you're running lots of tutors. Blue has lots of great artifact tutors. Don't forget the good board control cards you have access to. A lot of them are artifacts, so you can tutor them up. You have access to a ton of really good counter spells. Definitely don't neglect the counter spells. It may seem like you have to spend a lot of spots on your deck on control cards, but it's Blue's strong point, so make sure you're not neglecting it. And make sure you've got the Plan B Infect win lined up, because, like, yeah, that's really important. I should mention I'm only semi-joking, because I actually played a Zami against this deck. My brother was using this deck, and I think we both hindered each other's generals. So I kicked a Rite of Replication on his Plague Mirror, and I was able to push through 10 poison damage. It was not a very proud moment for either of us, and we don't speak of it, but there you go. It is possible. So that's the deck. You know, I don't think you should shy away from playing a deck like this, especially if someone in your play group is playing one of these high-powered combo decks. It's kind of fun to actually bounce these Tier 1 decks off each other and see how they can compete. Definitely don't bring a deck like this to a table full of, you know, Tier 2 decks, because they're not going to like it. They're probably going to hate you off the table pretty quickly. The good news is it is possible to win 3-on-1, so if you need an ego boost, then go for it. So there you go. Hope you enjoyed it.